Thanks to everyone who's joining our webinar. I appreciate you taking the time out of your, no doubt, busy schedules. I'm Darren Meyer. I'm a staff research engineer with Endor Labs, and I'm very excited about today because this is a little different than our usual webinar fare. We're going to have a discussion about an emerging trend in application security and DevSecOps, and we have a really very highly qualified guests with us today. The particular topic, of course, is security pipelines, and we have our special guest, Mr. Kayra Otaner. Did I say that right, Kayra?
Yes, you did.
Fantastic. He's a director of DevSecOps at Roche currently. He's been a pioneer for the security pipelines pattern as well as DevSecOps in general throughout his career. And with him, I have our own Jamie Scott, who's a product leader who's been with us since the very beginning and has an extensive history of building and running AppSec programs as well. So I want to start with you, Kayra. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be with us today. A director of AppSec is not a thing that's taken lightly or has a lot of spare time. So I thank you about that. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of why you've become an advocate for DevSecOps and related patterns?
Yeah, I mean, I have been on this journey for about the last 20 years or so. I was a developer myself, focusing on web application development, and I did a lot of operation stuff, and also end up like working with for a lot of compliant companies, PCI compliant or SOX compliant or ISO compliant. Now with Roche, it's healthcare space. So when you are doing this regulated, you're working for regulated companies, you end up doing a lot of stuff that is that should be scalable. And that's the reason why we came up with this DevSecOps paradigm like 10 years ago, like 7 years ago. And the companies and enterprises supposed to start posting these roles, the DevSecOps roles. So we start using that terminology, but ultimately, this has been the theme for my life for the last 20 years. Prior to Roche, I was with ADP, WPP, and did some other startup consultancy myself. And attended a lot of conferences as a speaker for the DevSecOps space. And software supply chain, as you know, is one of the critical identified risk areas based on OWASP or other metrics. So that's the reason why we have this DevSecOps pipeline approach or pattern that we were going to talk about today.
Nice. And you mentioned that you've been doing this for 20 years. So you've been in application security pretty much since it's been a thing, like an identified thing.
Yes. I mean, back then we didn't call it application security, but yes. I mean,
Exactly.
a lot of things it wasn't properly identified as a security risk or gap or issues. But if you look at the number of CVs that are being disclosed, like across the years, like for 15 plus years, if I remember correctly, last 5 years has been skyrocketing, right? So now we talk about, real issues that is becoming more and more visible to a lot of people. That's why the need for scalability, need for like massive pipelines that does this for us instead of like silos or like small team approach.
Fantastic. And Jamie, I know that you have quite an extensive career in application security as well. Do you mind sharing with us a little bit about your background and interest in the topic?
Sure. So I'm a recovering security engineer. Spent the early part of my career doing everything across the security domain, ranging everything from deploying web gateways, deploying DLP solutions, all the way to starting to work in AppSec. Have been in AppSec probably about 6 to 7 years now. I'm at the point in my career where not necessarily on AppSec, but having been part of the early team at Endor Labs, I had the privilege to go through and deploy dozens of actual customers to understand where in their environment they had pain points and operationalize our solution. So I've seen everything from small organizations to huge organizations deploy and do that still on a daily basis.
Awesome. And I know as part of that, you have your ear to the ground across the industry for trends and things that, application security teams and related teams are doing. And I know you've brought up a few times that you're hearing people discuss this concept of a security pipeline more and more. When people say that, I know it's not like a rigorously defined term. So when people say it, like, what are they typically meaning? What are they really implementing?
Yeah. So to me, a security pipeline is a repeatable pattern, one that helps you to improve maturity over time. And at the end of the day, what a security pipeline actually is a way to monitor your holistic environment, scope things in, and then as you mature, it becomes, how do I set repeatable patterns so that I can make changes quickly in my environment and set patterns that can then be reused for specific languages or specific tasks. so that when a security team needs to, say, change tools, or they need a pattern for, say, Java 8, then they have one that they can plug and play with that can be reused throughout the environment. And also they have a path to make changes for that specific type of pattern very quickly. This helps them to improve visibility drastically, but also it reduces the total cost of ownership of security tooling holistically. Because if at the end of the day, if you're not actually, if you look at tools and how they're deployed today, the cost of a tool is generally significantly lower than the cost of switching and deploying that tool across your environment. So as you scale, this becomes much more of a need overall.
So would you say that it's more a tactic than it is technology about, getting security tooling controls out of the mainline build pipeline into something more maintainable?
Yeah, it's a necessity of scale. At the end of the day, you could have someone write a security pipeline for every individual repo that your organization invests in. But if you have a small security team of 3 to 15 people, this becomes unmaintainable very rapidly, especially because those 3 to 15 people are, even at scale, the people focused on AppSec. So when it comes to managing and becoming maintainable, security pipelines is a tactic because the cost is prohibitive to actually go to every individual team and say, hey, I need you to add these lines of code. Instead, you say, hey, I'm going to monitor you holistically and implement a pattern for me to understand your environment. But then I'm going to give you something where you can drag and drop a pattern in to understand very quickly what you actually can do and make it so that development teams easily adopt.
Yeah, we all know that AppSec teams are always as well funded and well staffed as we need them to be, right? That's been our joint experience. Yeah, we all know that.
It's about as well funded as Kayra's background.
Yeah, there you go. So, Kayra, I've seen you speak on this particular pattern and on DevSecOps in general, over the past several years. Do you, when you hear what like Jamie's describing as seeing what the industry is doing, does that kind of mesh well with what you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, one of the common problems that we are seeing is that though you have to inherently trust the developer to do the right thing, right? When you ask them to own security and get that integrated to CI and CI/CD pipelines, right? As part of their responsibilities. But you run into this problem of like maker checker problem. So you're asking people to tune the tools in a way that is going to reveal the issues, the leak secrets, CWEs, CVEs, all kinds of issues. So as a human nature, we have a tendency to swipe things under the carpet, right? So I've seen a lot of teams, not in my recent jobs, like for the last 10, 15 years, developers are trying to hide the stuff that is going to make their deliverables easier, like being business deliverables or UI features or anything that is coming from the business side. So by getting that decoupled from the responsibility of the dev-focused teams, having this DevSecOps pipeline or security pipeline, and concentrating your effort or SME space, SME group on that global feature, you prevent a couple things. First, the maker checker problem disappears because you have a independent group, segregation of duties, responsible for the identification and also possibly remediation. And also, you're much more agile because you can make a change across the whole enterprise, and that change is going to apply everywhere, not just one or two, product groups. And I'm talking about this mainly because of the large enterprise, based on large enterprise experience. We are talking about like hundreds of different product groups, thousands of repositories, multiple SCM servers, GitLabs, GitHubs, Azure DevOps, you name it, right? So that is not scalable if you ask or try to train people and get this CI/CD integrated security, customized for each one of those product spaces.
So really, I mean, what's driving it for you is a lot of questions of scale. Is it something that you would advise smaller organizations to consider as well?
Yes. I mean, here's the reason. I mean, I had a chance to, talk in RSA conference last year, and I coined this term DIY effect, do-it-yourself effect, right? So I'm going to give you a Docker file example as an example, right? So it's easy to create a Docker file. That's the plain text file that has like maybe like 50 parameters that you can define. And one of the most important one for us security folks is the user line. So you want to set the user to non-root user. And 67% of the time, based on my previous experience, the repositories that I was looking at, they were missing the simple stuff. And every single YouTube video or tutorial that you read about Dockerfile is mentioning that user has to be set to non-standard user. So you rely on developers to do this, even on a smaller scale. You run into issues, very simple, easy to fix issues, appearing all across your space. So you want to have that responsibility removed from the developers and have this check team checking for those type of very easy to identify issues, independent of the CI/CD embedded security mindset. Large enterprises are going to benefit from like scalability issues, and also like I have this massive control over the infrastructure. But even if you have like a couple development teams, you still want to have a different team independently and autonomously checking what's going on inside those repositories and inside those products.
Excellent. You said something that was interesting to me. You said independent from the CI/CD system, but I know, Jamie, in conversations that you and I have had, a lot of people are using that same tech stack to implement security pipelines. So what does that look like?
You don't want to like reinvent the wheel. You don't want to like recreate your own CI part of CI/CD infrastructure. If they're using Argo, you just use Argo. If you're using Jenkins, you use Jenkins. But the team is like instead of giving them their own control over the security checks that they need to run, you have an independent team either giving snippets or massively running in parallel to each repository. Because I've been using this metaphor for Saijo and Roche. We are looking at the DNS sequencing of all these applications by looking at the new source code, right? So you can possibly identify if there's a bad behavior or a sickness or disease that's going to show up in next 6 months by looking at the genes. So you want to have that independent eye on that sequencing of source code by having this group completely disconnected from the rest.
That makes a lot of sense. And Jamie, I know you've seen a few people start to kind of roll these out in stages. Where are people usually starting with having the conversation about security pipelines and building a design and a implementation path?
Sure. And that generally starts with your phase of maturity as an organization. So I would put it this way. Everyone starts with they need to get visibility. And because they need to, one, justify the risk management program, but two, they need to focus their attention on something, and they don't know. So first, many organizations who start at the phase of needing visibility are focused on creating a security pipeline that tries to monitor everything at once. And this way they have an engine to look for specific weaknesses, specific vulnerabilities, but also just get visibility into what the state of the state is. They then
just want to interrupt you for a second. When you say one thing, one pipeline to kind of monitor everything, is it like one independent pipeline that runs everywhere, or is it something people are copying?
So it's one independent pipeline that monitors all the things. So I would put it this way. You need to supervise your environment. If you're checking for potentially leaked secrets, then you want to expand breadth. If you're checking for vulnerabilities, you want to know what's out there. But at the same time, you're going to focus on your crown jewels, your publicly facing applications, and you need to first be able to have an asset inventory. So foundationally, you need an asset inventory, and people are starting with visibility by trying to get that asset inventory in a way that they can assign risk to it. So yes, this is an independent pipeline managed by the security team, but that's so that they can get visibility holistically. And that way they can actually say, here's issues systemic to my environment. Here's issues that I might not be focusing on if I just have the crown jewels and publicly facing apps being monitored, but also I want to pay special attention to those. They then shift over to how do I establish more robust workflows? If a security team is identifying things, you still need to ask people to do work. Most security teams either don't have the access, the ability, or the actual authorization in order to make meaningful change when it comes to application security. They're accountable, but they're not necessarily always responsible. then they need to focus their attention as kind of that next level of maturity. And that's where they start saying, hey, how do I actually get repeatable patterns? And how do I identify what is most important in my environment? And then how do I understand which findings I should focus my time on and spend my credibility on asking my dev teams to do work? And then they start to govern that over time and make holistic improvements as they monitor that program.
Interesting. Kayra, is that kind of how you've rolled this out in organizations where you've been the director as well?
Yes, I mean, one thing that we should also talk about in this context is there's the newer version of cybersecurity framework 2.0, right? And as you might remember, cybersecurity framework was first launched in 2013, and that did not have the governance function. It had this 4 or 5 pillars: identify, protect, detect, and remediate. Right? Those 4 or 5 pillars got the new one, which is the governance function. And what Jamie is talking about, what we are trying to implement over here, is to have this governance function. And again, the CSF 2.0 was launched August 2023, if I'm not mistaken. That was drafted and that got published. That brings us to that level of maturity journey, because without the governance at the large organizations, medium to large organization size, you cannot fully implement security. You are at the danger of the capabilities of individual teams and their maturity levels, and relying on that is too risky for medium to large organizations. So implementation is a different journey, but all this maturity, all the frameworks that we are talking about, all the tooling that is evolving and emerging are making things easier for us to have this bigger governance pipeline. Some product vendors are also calling this compliance pipeline. We don't use that terminology. We call it DevSecOps pipeline, which is essentially trying to do the same thing, owned by a dedicated group of individuals that does oversee that for the whole organization.
You touched on this a couple of times. A couple of things you said in that answer and things before touched a little bit on kind of signals in an organization that developing a security pipeline might be a good way to go. Can I ask you to be a little more explicit about that? Like, what do you feel if you looked at an organization and said, "Is this a good fit for this organization?" What are you looking for?
Oh, anytime you have a need for compliance, regulation, right? 80%, 90% of the regulations talks about like segregation of duties. And this goes back to maker checker problem, right? If you're a small startup, emerging, still trying to find the product market fit, not regulated, you may want to be agile and not have this dedicated team that's going to do the checks and balance for what you're working on. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about that. But if you're shooting for PCI compliance, ISO 27001, or any type of compliance, the segregation duty is right there. This might sound like anti-DevSecOps, because you remember the core promise of DevSecOps is breaking up silos, so everyone does everything, right? You do the dev and the ops and the security. That's the reason why I have this background over here. So, in my opinion, this is DevSecOps, right? This is the dev, chicken is dev, the security is Peter Griffin, and this guy trying to do the time travel is ops, so he doesn't care. But there's constant friction between dev and security. So ultimately, if you can tolerate that type of friction in small organization, and not have compliance regulatory requirements, perfectly fine. At that level, the rules of physics change. You start having this external entities auditing you, asking you all these questions. Then you realize that, the way that we implement DevSecOps is not compatible with the requirements that we are facing today. So that is the litmus test I would recommend to any company if they are shooting for regulation. They have to envision a solution that is having, this DevSecOps pipeline.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it almost seems like a little bit opposite to, the recent trends in the industry to do the shift left type things. And I know that's an area, Jamie, that you have a lot of opinions on. Is, we've tried shift left and it hasn't always gone well. Where do you think that has encountered problems, and does the security pipeline pattern address any of that?
I think to speak a little bit about Kayra's do-it-yourself mentality, the problem with shifting to DevSecOps is I just bought a new house in Florida. I try and put up my TV, I get everything. I realize immediately, because it's my first house, I don't know where the actual beams are. So where do I hang this thing up? My wife, I start to go to Lowe's and my wife goes, no, I'm ordering this from Costco. We're having a professional install it. I might have broken a wall on the way trying to do it, and that's why. But at the end of the day, I'm just sitting there YouTubing. And I understood what I was trying to do, but I don't know how to do it well. I'm not a professional. And I had friends ping me after I posted something similar like to that on LinkedIn, and they were like, yeah, it's easy, just YouTube it. And I laughed because I was like, yeah, my wife wouldn't let me. And because I already broke something. And like sometimes it's actually prudent to have a professional on board. So I think first the primary driver is as you shift left, it's important to remember that developers, one, aren't necessarily primarily motivated by security. It's not their primary focus. If you ask a developer what their top 10 actual responsibilities or priorities are, they're going to say features, bugs, performance, testing. Only somewhere after that, a few levels down, does security really fall into the picture for them. So it's a conflict between motivation and actual area of focus where it creates friction with DevSecOps pipelines. So I do think there needs to be a place where security guidance is necessary. Because sure, you can have a savant developer who knows exactly what to do and is totally handy, unlike me with my house. But at the end of the day, you can't expect everyone to do that. Like you can't expect, there's a reason there's a market for handymen at the end of the day. There's a reason there's a market for security people. It's because at the end of the day, we are professionals at what we do, and we have to help guide people so they're not YouTubing what to do. And as Kayra said, it's really easy to get Kubernetes tokens in a container if you are put as root and you have a remote code execution vulnerability. That being said, not everyone thinks, hey, I shouldn't, my default is user 0, buildpacks.io. Kayra, you want to answer that?
Yeah, so here's one thing that I should also mention. I kind of talk about this when we say shift left. So what are we shifting left? Are we shifting left the responsibility to the dev, or are we shifting left the expertise to the left, right? We want to shift the expertise to the left and have security folks do more coding instead of developers doing more security. So that is this difference. And I want to give you another example that I also gave in RRC conference. And internet is full of memes. So let's remove security from this context and talk about the databases. I've seen hundreds of times developers putting code SQL queries to the production on a table that has millions of rows without a where statement or with a missing index. The databases or SQL is very easy to learn, but they keep missing this important index concept or a where statement concept when they're pushing code. I've seen a lot of big organizations, large organizations, killing the databases during production deployment because developers tested this thing on a dev environment that has only 50 rows in the table, where in production you have like millions of rows. So even teaching SQL to the developers has been a challenge. SQL has been around for like ages, right? We're not even talking about security type of complicated stuff. It has been around for like 40 years. So we failed to teach very fundamental concepts of database modeling, database maintenance, or where state, importance of the index and where statements to the developers. Now we are expecting with the shifting left, show people how to create, a secure coding, not to make the top 10 or last top 10 mistakes, not leak secrets, be an expert on Docker. That's why I showed this build pack IO, right? So, and a lot of responsibilities, more sophisticated responsibilities are coming towards the dev's way if you understand the dev shifting left as responsibility shifts, right? So I want to talk about the DevSecOps pipeline thing in two folds, 2 dimensions, 2 layers. One of them is the detection, right? So I want to use this global pipeline for detection, which helps us with the governance function, right? So you want to do mass detection capabilities for the governance function that you are running. But also, like the tools that are evolving, it removes these, like Buildpacks is a good prime example. You can remove developers from containerization and have your Docker file or container images, I should say, created without a Docker file or without developer involvement. And there are a lot of advances in getting that responsibility of packaging applications into or getting those applications ready for the production and get that handled in an automated way, like with the pipelines that we are talking about. So, but we have to be open and aware of all these new trends and emerging technologies, and also be aware of this new maturity targets that CSF 2.0 has been setting. Like you have to have the governance function. So there are a lot of things to unpack here. We are just talking about a lot of things in arbitrary, but ultimately the DIY effect is real. And as Jamie, you mentioned, by just watching YouTube videos or reading tutorials on how to maintain your home, you will end up spending a lot of money, like myself, trying to fix things and break things instead of fixing things.
Yeah, something I heard you both talk about was kind of this idea of responsibility versus ownership in a way, where like, Jamie, in your example, like you owned getting the TV mounted, but that doesn't mean you had to be responsible for every step of it. And I think that maps really well to, what you were saying, Kayra, of like, we've often said, oh, you guys have to execute on everything. And we haven't given developers the tools really to do that well. So being that kind of consultant and letting the developers have that ownership over having secure code, but also, not necessarily being responsible for executing on that, to have a Jamie's wife as a CTO, right? Who says, no, we're not going to do it this way. We're going to do it in a way that's sensible and have the right people doing it. It actually ties nicely into one of the questions one of our attendees asked, which is, none of this seems to really map to runtime analysis at all. And there's an increase in runtime tools in the environment. How do you fit something like that into this security pipeline pattern?
Kayra, you want to go first?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, ultimately, what we are talking about today is, and I'm coming from a NetSec background, which is we focus on network situational awareness. The keyword over here is security posture management, right? Whether it's runtime or pre-runtime or static code that is sitting on the desk on a Git repository, inside a Git repository, you have to be aware of all possible issues, risks that might happen when you have this thing deployed publicly, right? Client facing or customer facing. So runtime protection, runtime infrastructure tools are, in my opinion, last line of defense in this day and age, right? You don't want to miss any of those additional layers that might possibly strengthen your security posture, but it's not the place that I would start. I would start with the code that is your genes. And I wouldn't let people self-diagnose their things based on the DNA analysis that you give it to them and try to cure themselves. Have the other team try to diagnose the problem, detect the problem, and proactively remediate the problem before runtime protection measures takes effect.
I would put it this way. If you find an issue once it exists and is already a burning hole, runtime is a necessity, but it's putting out fires and identifying fires. As you start to shift left, the mentality is, how do I proactively put out those fires so that it doesn't become a forest fire like we see in California, but it's more controlled? So I was just in Thailand and they have controlled fires. A runtime tool is identifying the fire. A tool in a pipeline is figuring out how to manage that fire more effectively.
Interesting. So we've talked a little bit about why you do want to do this, but I want to flip it on you two a little bit. We all know we're security people. We know nothing's a panacea. Like you're never going to implement something that's going to fix all your problems. So like, what are the downsides? What are the trade-offs people are making? What are the things that are kind of counter indications for following this pattern? Why don't we start with you, Jamie?
Counter indications to not need a security pipeline?
Yeah, why might you not want to do that?
So one of the hardest things is to acknowledge the skill gap that we have in the industry. And implementing security pipelines does require, to an extent, that you have skill set in DevOps. If you can't write a pipeline, then managing your own security pipeline is kind of a non-starter. Maybe that means we need to address the skill gap, but it all is a makeup of your team at the end of the day. So I would say The first reason why you wouldn't want to do that is because you don't necessarily have the skill set, but that just means maybe you need to hire for one. The secondary one is trade-offs. And going in with a clear mind on trade-offs is what I think is incredibly important. So if you have a security pipeline that, let's just use SCA for an example, and you want the most accurate results. Well, the actual dependencies used in the software you ship are generally a function of the version of your runtime, the version of your package manager, the time of build, and how you declare your dependencies in your manifest file, whether you're actually using a lock file or you're just building every time. And that's ecosystem dependent as well. The reality is that if you try and mass scan your whole environment and you're not primarily using lock files in your environment, then you're going to get a semblance of range from more accurate results to completely inaccurate results to completely miss things. So if you're not using the exact tools and versions of those tools and respecting that build time, you're going to create some noise. For some people, that's acceptable. If that's unacceptable and you have significant friction with your development team, maybe you want to start shifting to actual pipeline integrations. So starting to understand those trade-offs is where I think foundationally people need to start. I would also argue that you shouldn't be focusing on a security pipeline if you have more foundational issues. So it's a function of your maturity. If you don't have an asset inventory at the end of the day and you don't know what's there, well, you can scan the world, but you can't say, okay, I'm going to focus on these things. So you could be spending a lot of your time yelling about issues in an internal doc site versus the crown jewel of your business. So I would say foundationally, first, you do need some foundational controls, but secondarily, it's about that prioritization effort.
Sure, yeah. It sounds like you're talking about the kind of the main trade-off being maturity, like readiness. You could invest a lot of time in something that doesn't deliver the value that you need, but also in specificity, right? So a pipeline is going to apply generally to a wide swath of things, whereas like an individual integration to a particular build can be fine-tuned to that particular environment, and making those trade-offs there of, you know, what matters more to your risk management needs. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yep, that's it.
Awesome. So, Kayra, you've been an advocate for this pattern for a long time. What would your take be on that? When would you recommend people not do this?
There is one size fits all approach is not reasonable in anything that we do, right? There's also other end of the spectrum, one size fits none, right? So we have to understand that this is a security maturity journey, right? And I'm going to give you another example from my life as an example. My kids turned to 16, they got this learner's permit, right? Knowing that they will be 21 one day, they were not allowed to drive with another person, another kid, their friends, you know, in New Jersey at least. There has to be a parent right next to them for about a year. And then they start driving by themselves with another friend of theirs up until 11 p.m., 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. And after they pass the 18 years old, now they can drive without restrictions. First, they were only allowed to drive in New Jersey. So this is a maturity journey, right? Just because we are telling people not to adopt this DevSecOps pipeline globally, it should be in their North Star. They should be aware of that. There is no easy way for them to continue with the pattern that they are in today. So if you're like small team, less than 10 individuals actively participating in the security ops and dev, you don't want to deal with the overhead of like having this global pipeline, having 2 people separated from the team doing this type of stuff. That's when you are 16 years old. But you should know that you will be 21 one day and you will be driving interstate or internationally. So that is the journey that you should be aware of. The one size fits all approach, the old conventional DevSecOps pattern dictates you that, oh, you have to have the CI/CD integrated thing. You have to own security. That's not scalable. Based on my experience, based on a lot of people's experience, this is not scalable and it's not going to work. That's why we call this an anti-pattern, right? So that realization is going to help you today, because you're not going to invest extensively into your 16-year-old the driving experience and assume that you will be only driving in the state, right? That's a metaphor that I can give you to counter argument what you were saying, that there are a lot of advantages of both and disadvantages of both depending on where you are standing in your security maturity journey.
So it sounds a lot like you're saying, that this is a tactic, and you're not going to get all the way to the end state of that tactic at once, and you probably shouldn't. But that
Yes.
every organization can benefit from thinking about and applying that tactic where it makes sense. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. This was a lot of conversation at once. So I'm curious a little bit. And we haven't had a lot of Q&A to people, so I want to leave some time for Q&A for everyone. But I want to give you each a little summary time. Like if you were to have our audience today come away with, one or two things that you think are really important to know about security pipelines and whether they might make sense in their org, what would you ask? Why don't we start with you, Kayra?
I mean, one of the things that I recommend today to anyone is to stay agnostic, right? You don't want to assume that you're staying with one SCM provider or one cloud provider or one security tool. One of the hidden advantages of that pipeline, global pipeline, is that you can plug and play all the scanning tools or tools that you choose at a scale, without too much of a hassle or individually managing all those CI/CD stuff. So that's a hidden advantage. And also, as we have been talking about for the last 35 minutes or so, you start small. So anytime you integrate security to your single CI/CD infrastructure, those steps or phases in your CI/CD infra is going to turn into a global pipeline sometime soon. It's not going to be too hard to make that happen. In my opinion, depending on the tool stack that you're in, like whether you're in cloud native infrastructure or a non-cloud infrastructure or like just air gap infrastructure, the tool choice varies, and being flexible and being agnostic is the key when it comes to security. So that's one thing that I recommend to anyone when implementing DevSecOps pipelines.
How about you, Jimmy?
Sure. And I want to share one slide really quickly to make my point. I think the most important thing is that we can't be this person. So too many times security teams try to seek process maturity at the expense of better. And we see people say, hey, this is fine, but everything is on fire. What's my problem? And at the end of the day, if you're after saying, I want to break every build, but you don't have visibility into anything at this point, where is your priority? And implementing global security pipelines that monitor everything and getting visibility should be a priority to, say, trying to block every critical from entering your environment. And accepting that as a North Star versus what your next step is, I think is the most important differentiation. Because too often we see people try and throw all of the things immediately without actually thinking, what is my next step in maturity? And if we start from, this is my North Star, but these are the steps I need to take, that's a much better way to approach than I'm going to integrate everything in CI and I'm going to start breaking builds. Like we have customers who have taken a year to start breaking builds, and we have customers who took 2 weeks. Now, completely a function of their skill set and level of maturity. But before you take that into consideration, that is exactly the thing that you should think first. And if you're not thinking that first, then you failed as implementing that program.
I love the comic. It kind of reminded me of I heard a salesperson once say that like it's kind of like walking into an ER and you have profound injuries and you're getting a lecture about your diet and exercise program, right? Like that might be true. You might need that, but right now I'm seriously injured. So it seems like kind of that same spirit of like you have to sometimes you got to stop the bleeding before you can work on general health and wellness. Is that a fair thing to say?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, we spent about 45 minutes talking together, and I really appreciate the two of you taking time out of your day, and of course our attendees taking their time as well. I'd like to open the floor if anybody has any questions they'd like to pose to Kayra or Jamie.
Yeah, I want to pull out a comment from the chat. Maybe we can discuss it a little bit. I think with everything going on, we might have missed it. So Brian said, it's also about behavior change, kind of like baking a cake. If you use spoiled milk, it's likely your cake will taste bad and get people sick. If you know the milk is bad because the expiration date is expired, it's your responsibility to go to the store and get fresh milk. Same with the developer. It's their responsibility to determine if a third party or custom code is bad and fix it. So reactions, thoughts?
So in that example, it's not easy for people in develop an application security space if their code that they're including into their product is open for exploitation today or not. It might be tomorrow. It might be deeply buried that you don't know yet. So the expiration date is not that clearly visible, right? So, but having said that, there are a lot of teams that are still shipping log4j vulnerable version, right? And one thing that I should also mention on this context is CISA has a new initiative called end of life, end of support management, right? So you like it or not, we have to ship old legacy code into our critical infrastructure. We have to deal with the CVEs because they are not exploitable under the circumstances that they are deployed in. So the milk spoiled may be a good thing for making a cheese, right? So, or yogurt maybe, or some other stuff, right? So the end of life, end of support management is critical, and understanding the context you're in. And this all plays well into the SBOM discussion, and also the VEX, vulnerable to exploitative exchange information. You might have justification for shipping that spoiled milk. And the enterprises and the critical infrastructure are full of legacy code. And this is a pattern that we need to accept. Again, this is not one size fits all ecosystem. Whatever we talk about today, the team for next 10, 20 years is going to be one size and not going to be applicable to everywhere. You cannot just kill dependency just because there are some critical vulnerabilities with an asterisk saying that they are not on KEV, non-exploited vulnerabilities. It doesn't prevent you from shipping. So I know that there might be a lot of heat coming this way just because of that, but KEV is an important indicator for things where you might be able to ship or you might never should consider shipping.
And the comment mentioned behavior change, and I do think that's an important concept, right? Like one of the things that we struggle with in security is getting developers and others to change their behavior to, be more secure in the first place, right? Not just detect and respond. And I think that speaks to a point you made earlier, Kayra, about like having these pipelines be things that shift that responsibility for execution onto security to guide what the developer behavior should be, and they can see patterns and things from that. And so there's a degree of education that happens if this is done well. Have either of you seen like this kind of approach be used to better educate developers and kind of raise that bar to begin with?
I'll start here. I agree that behavior change is really important. That being said, I think it's an unreasonable goal in the long term. What we shouldn't do is try to get people to change behavior. We should make it so that they have the right behavior without needing to change significantly. Now, at the end of the day, behavior change is something we all seek. And it's still good to create awareness and try and change that behavior. But that said, we need to make it easier for people to make the right decisions without actually trying to get them to change the behavior. So it's like Kayra said earlier, he has build packs here. He's not trying to have everyone write a user instruction. He's trying to make it easier for people to introduce a behavior. So having a platform team to introduce libraries that are used for security handling, that one makes it easier on a developer to not only do the right pattern, it makes your experience consistent, and it makes it simple for someone to use. So you've motivated someone by making it easy, and you've also introduced the right behavior. So that's why I agree education is important, but I don't believe that the onus is on the developer.
Right, so it sounds like what you're saying is our goal as security should be to like change behavior by making the right behaviors the easiest and obvious path, rather than trying to be forcing people to work against their own interests. Is that?
Yep.
What do you think about that, Kayra?
One thing that I might be able to add is that the trust but verify is the key. I mean, you don't want to expect them to do the behavior change overnight, right? that's a journey, a maturity journey. We want to like have a passionately, convince them to do that behavioral change. But just because your kid turns 21, you don't want to cancel your liability or car insurance, right? That is a risk out there. So trust but verify is a key. And also like all this frameworks that we are talking about talks about zero trust. I want to trust you, but I don't want to trust you. So there's this internal conflict right there. So the governance function, all the influence, behavioral change that we expect to happen should happen, but it's not going to change the way that we architect our solutions or automations or pipelines. We're going to have this safety net built, a parallel pipeline that is almost like the last line of defense before things get shipped to runtime, has to be there to check if the behavioral change happened or not.
100%. I really like that model. I don't see any more questions roll in. A reminder, if anyone does have questions, we have a couple more minutes. But I did want to just take an opportunity to thank both you and Jamie for joining us today. I know you're both very, very busy people, and I think that this is a lot of value and a very interesting conversation to have with our team.
All right,
Thanks.
we have blocked until about another 10 minutes. We won't take that whole time if nobody has questions, but I know sometimes it takes a moment to think your question and then use the fingers to type. So Kayra, I'll ask you, outside of this whole security pipeline thing, what's something that you're excited to work on this year?
So one of the motivations that I'm excited to see in everyone that I've met in RSA conference is the ability to have LLMs or AI deploy, getting into the level that we can deploy at scale. But one of the biggest prerequisites is to have this visibility or the global pipeline like infrastructure into our infrastructure. So my motivation is to be able to get this LLMs or AI deployed in full automation capabilities and get the pipeline executed by these tools, so that we have this automated remediation taking place. So it sounds too good to be true, but I know that's achievable. And a lot of the people that you might also have interacted in our RSA conference are, for the very first time in the last 10 years, 15 years maybe, are very optimistic about the balance being shifting from blue teams to red teams, right? The attackers are losing ground because we have the budget and intention and motivation and the tools to make this happen finally.
All right, I think we're about done. So why don't we go ahead and wrap up? Kayra, Jamie, Darren, thank you for your time. As we've said, this is recorded. We'll pop it up on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel. You'll be the first to know. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us, Kayra.
Thank you.